I would just add that it appears that the Iranians have shut down Fujairah. They're two important ports where oil is continuing to come out of the Middle East. One is Yanbu, which is the Saudi port on the Red Sea. And as you said, it looks like the Houthis may shut down the Red Sea. And that means that the Saudi oil going to Yanbu will not come out of the Red Sea. And I would just note quickly that even if the Houthis don't shut down the Bab al-Mandab Strait, which is what closes off or potentially could close off the Red Sea, the Iranians could just attack Yanbu and shut down the flow of Saudi oil coming out of Yanbu. And as I said, they've already shut down the flow of oil coming out of Fujairah. And that's the United Arab Emirates port on the Sea of Oman that is outside of the Strait of Hormuz. So it's just very important to understand the UAE has been shipping probably about 1.7, 1.8 million barrels a day out of Fujairah. And that's now been cut off. And it looks like the Saudi oil flow out of the Red Sea is likely to be cut off as well. So I just wanted to emphasize that those two places, Fujairah and Yanbu, really do matter. And both are now involved in the mix in a serious way. I think to answer your question, Glenn, what's happening here is that the war is escalating more horizontally than vertically. You remember we had this big air war from February 28th to about April 8th. And then the air war ended and we transitioned on April 13th to the blockade. Well, these tit-for-tat attacks that are now taking place every day for probably about the past 8 days are not the same as the air war. They're not that extensive. And a lot of people are wondering whether we will vertically escalate and in effect go back to the air war that took place in the first 40 days of this conflict. That has not happened yet. But there is, and you described it very well, this horizontal escalation that is taking place. I don't think that Jordan had been hit before 2 days ago, but it's clear that the Americans are now that the American base in Jordan is now being pounded. And of course, the Gulf states are being pounded. And it looks like, we see substantial horizontal escalation, especially when you throw in the whole Yanbu and Fujairah scenarios that I described when I began talking. So this one is escalating for sure.
Well, it's always difficult to make predictions, but, a good point of departure would be to assess the strategies of each side. That is, what are the objectives they aim to achieve? What resources can they mobilize to achieve those objectives? How do you see the theory of what a victory might look like if you see it from the American perspective versus the Iranian? What is it that each side want to achieve here, and how can they actually achieve it?
Yeah, great question. Let's just start with the Americans. I don't believe that they have a theory of victory. I believe that President Trump is just flailing around. If you go back to June 17th and the memorandum of understanding that was signed that day, that was basically a surrender document. It's quite clear that the Iranians won on almost every point. If you look at the 14 articles, it looks clear to me that the Iranians won and we, the United States, lost. So the question you then have to ask yourself is, given what's happened since that memorandum was signed on June 17th, what have we done militarily to change the situation? Where's our new coercive leverage coming from? I mean, we obviously didn't have much coercive leverage before the signing of the June 17th Memorandum of Understanding. Otherwise, we wouldn't have signed it because it was a surrender document. So you have to be able to make the argument that we now have some sort of military capability or economic capability to change the situation that existed on June 17th. And I see no evidence of that. If you look at what Trump has done, he's done two things. One, he's now reinstituted the blockade. And the blockade, the original blockade, went from April 13th until June 17th, when the Memorandum of Understanding was signed. That's a little over 2 months. It didn't work. That's why we signed the Memorandum of Understanding. It just didn't work. So why do we think it's going to work now? I have no idea what they're thinking. I can't see why it's going to work now when it didn't work in the past. The second thing that's happened is since last Tuesday, this is July 7th, President Trump has gotten back into the tit-for-tat business with the Iranians. And since last Tuesday, July 7th, up till today, July 15th, the Iranians and the Americans are engaged in a tit-for-tat campaign. Well, if a serious strategic bombing campaign didn't work in the first 40 days, and we've played the tit-for-tat game before. We played it between June 26th and June 29th, and it didn't work. Why do we think it's going to work now? And if you look at what's actually happening in this tit-for-tat campaign, there's no evidence that we have the upper hand. The Iranians are pounding countries like Kuwait, Bahrain, Jordan, and so forth and so on. The Iranians have shut down Fujairah, as I said. So this tit-for-tat campaign does not appear to me, or hardly anybody I know, to be working. So the tit-for-tat campaign isn't working, and another blockade is not going to work. So how do we get the coercive leverage to get a new memorandum of understanding where we do much better the next time than we did on June 17th? I don't see a plausible story there that can support the argument that we are going to win this time, whereas we did not last time.
Yeah, no, it's well, one gets the impression sometimes that there might not actually be a plan in place. That is, I saw, of course, yes, you did as well. Trump, he announced this 20% fee on all ships transiting the Strait of Hormuz, and then, you know, I think it was only 4 hours later, he had to start walking back, saying, we're not going to put fees on ships. This, shouldn't be fees anywhere. It's just very hard to see. All of this essentially suggests that there might not actually be a strategy here, that they just going, day to day, which, if this is the case, it's quite concerning. But if you see it from the Iranian perspective, what is it that, is it only to make sure that the US bases get wiped out? They put the global economy at stake, given that the world would blame the US and Israel? Or how do you see what's the silver bullet here for the Iranians? Is it controlling the Strait of Hormuz, or how does Iran win? Or to some extent, perhaps it already did win.
Well, look, there's going to be some sort of agreement at some point in time, in all likelihood. I find it hard to believe that you're not going to get some sort of understanding. Just think about the nuclear issue. The United States and the Israelis are desperate to get a nuclear agreement. And you can't get a nuclear agreement unless you stop this fighting and you get a new memorandum of understanding. There's just no way around that. So there are just all these issues on the table, economic and political and military, that were encapsulated in the 14-point memorandum of understanding on June 17th. And the point is that somewhere down the road, you're going to get another memorandum of understanding or something that looks like that. I don't know exactly where we're headed, but there has to be, in my opinion, some sort of agreement. This can't go on forever, certainly from an American point of view. So then the question is, how do the Iranians think about this? Now, on June 17th, when they signed the Memorandum of Understanding, there were a lot of people, usually referred to as the hardliners in Iran, who thought it was too early to cut a deal. You don't want to cut a deal now. You've got the United States over a barrel. You got them right where you want them. Let's just keep this war going. And the more time goes by, the better the deal we get. That's what the hardliners said. They also said, you really can't trust the Americans. You have to have the Americans in a desperate situation before you can really work out a deal. The hardliners, however, lost. And the middle of the roaders won, and you got the Memorandum of Understanding, which was signed by the Iranians. Well, I argued at the time, not publicly, but to a number of my friends who agreed with me, that the hardliners were right. They should have waited. And the hardliners have now triumphed. And the Iranians are not just going to go back to the Memorandum of Understanding easily. They're going to drive a really hard bargain because they understand that the longer the war goes on, the better that is for Iran, because the more bargaining leverage they have. The closer we get to the cliff economically, and the more desperate the Trump administration gets, the more likely it is that Iran will get a really good deal and that the Americans will be forced to stick to that deal. So I think what's happening inside Iran now is that the hardliners have won, and they have no interest in going back to negotiations anytime soon. And furthermore, if they do go back to negotiations, whenever that is, they want to drive a really hard bargain. And the longer they wait, the more coercive leverage they have. So I think that actually what Trump is doing is he's playing right into the hands of the hardliners. And the longer that he continues to escalate, the more coercive leverage the Iranians have. And I think, to be honest, that Trump understands this. This is why I think he's saying that if this isn't settled by next week, what I'm going to do is attack bridges and power stations. That's what he said. Well, why is he talking about going after bridges and power stations next week? Because he knows that he cannot let this go on. And the other reason, just to add to the mix, the other reason he can't let this go on is the United States does not have sufficient munitions to wage a long war. Remember, we stopped the 40-day war on April 8th, in part because we were running out of munitions. And we don't want to go back to a full-scale air war because we don't have the munitions. So a tit for tat is a tolerable alternative strategy, but only for a while. Because after a long period of time, a tit for tat strategy eats up all that spare weaponry or remaining weaponry as well. So Trump has a vested interest in bringing this to an end. And that's why he's talking about going after bridges and going after power stations. But the problem there is we've talked about many times, as you go up the escalation ladder, the Iranians can do all sorts of things to you. You don't have, you meaning the Americans, don't have escalation dominance here. And what's happening with regard to Fujairah and Yanbu and the Red Sea more generally is just evidence of that. The Iranians are basically saying, if we can't let Iranian oil into world oil markets, no oil will come out of the Middle East. We're going to shut down the flow of all oil. this would have disastrous consequences for the international economy.
Yeah, and yeah, as you said, well, what can be added there is why start next week with bridges and power stations? I mean, these things could have been attacked early on, but I think Trump also knows that once the U.S. decides to go after critical infrastructure, the the Iranians would do the same, of course, in the Gulf states. This is the reason. But so it just looks like for the Iranians, all they have to do is, if the US goes up the escalation ladder, to absorb the pain and then retaliate in kind against the US allies in the Gulf states. And but then what does Trump do? Because it seems like the whole strategy is premised on the idea that the Iranians would, get hammered and then, well, essentially cry uncle. We will, submit to U.S. demands. I just don't see this happening, given how much is at stake here. But let me ask you, what do you see being the wider consequences of this war? That is a defeat for the United States, because it has depleted a lot of military resources. You can argue there's going to be an economic consequence for this. Obviously, geostrategic with the shift of power in the Middle East, but if you look at the wider implications, that is the U.S. security umbrella worldwide, I see reports, from Japan, South Korea, that their military assets are either being diverted away or not arriving. You hear similar comments from the Europeans. How do you see? What will be the consequence of this war? Because it seems it's difficult to measure that this war is. A defeat here would be quite different than, let's say, a defeat in Afghanistan or Iraq.
Well, I think if you're talking about the alliance structure and the American basing structure in the Persian Gulf itself, I think this is going to have huge consequences. There's no way that can be avoided. The question that you're raising is what happens outside of the Gulf. I think with regard to East Asia, the United States has already weakened its deterrent posture with regard to containing China. I think there's no doubt about that. As I've said on the show before, instead of pivoting to Asia, we've been pivoting away from Asia because we've moved a lot of precious assets, military assets, out of East Asia to the Middle East in recent months. So we've weakened our hand in East Asia. But the fact is, Glenn, the United States and the East Asian allies need each other, and they will continue to work together. I think there's no doubt that the South Koreans and the Japanese, among others, have real doubts about American judgment at this point in time. As you watch the Trump administration flail around, it's probably quite disconcerting if you're a Japanese or South Korean leader to think that you depend on the United States of America to provide a security umbrella for you, because that can't help but not be very reassuring. But again, the South Koreans, the Japanese, the other East Asian countries allied with the United States just don't have much choice but to work with America to contain China. And of course, from the United States' point of view, containing China is of great importance. So I think in the final analysis, the effects of this defeat in the Gulf will only have limited effects on America's alliance structure in East Asia. With regard to Ukraine and Russia, and therefore the question of what America's commitment to Europe looks like, it's very hard to read that situation. It looked up until recently like Trump was trying to greatly reduce the American military footprint in Europe and shift the burden of dealing with Russia in Ukraine over to the Europeans. That appears to have changed, though. If you look at what happened at the G7 meeting in France in mid-June. And if you look at what happened at the NATO summit in Ankara in early July, it looks like, if anything, the Americans have enthusiastically, and here we're talking about President Trump, he has enthusiastically endorsed the European campaign to help Ukraine wage war against Russia. So it doesn't look like our commitment to Europe and to NATO is at the moment being diminished. But it's very hard to say how this will play itself out over time. In good part because Trump changes his view, every other day. And, he can turn on the Europeans on a dime. So who knows exactly what will happen there. But for the time being, it looks like this disaster in the Gulf is not having negative effects on the NATO alliance.